The birth and growth of rock. Now, even though Ike Turner's credited with writing the first rock song with 1952's Rocket 88, rock really had its birth in Memphis, Tennessee. In a tiny recording studio not half the size of our classroom named Sun Records, the rock revolution was born. In 1955, studio owner and record producer Sam Phillips recorded country, blues, R&B musicians alike, all in this tiny studio, which allowed for a lot of ethnic and musical intermingling. Musicians wanted to hear each other's stuff. They even wanted to learn each other's tricks, and it wasn't uncommon for country artists at Sun to play with blues or R&B artists. Sun Records, under Phillips' guidance, established a sense of egalitarianism where skin color did not matter, only your ability to play and sing. In 1954 and 1955, a number of people who would go on to become musical giants all recorded together at Sun. Some recording their first hits. Early rock and roll artists like Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Blue Suede Shoes Perkins, Elvis Presley, and Roy Pretty Woman Orbison recorded alongside country artist Johnny Cash and blues artist B.B. King. All of these artists had their first big hits with Sun Records and put Memphis, Tennessee on the musical map. Despite being in a segregated state in the northern end of the South, prejudice over skin color disappeared with the musicians at Sun Records. Black and white sounds blended seamlessly. Even though it was against the law in some states for these artists to share the same stage, that never stopped black artists from coming to see whites play, or vice versa. Rock and roll was born from the mixture of black and white music, a perfect blending of the best, most exciting portions of both kinds of sounds, and boy did it make money. Over his career, Elvis is estimated to have sold nearly 1 billion records around the world. No doubt his youth, good looks, and energy would help propel him to the title of the King of Rock and Roll, but other artists in the 1950s were quite successful too. Little Richard's singles for Tutti Frutti and Good Golly Miss Molly sold millions of copies in the 50s, along with music by Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry. Part of what explained the financial success of these early rock artists was television. Now, teen music wasn't just heard, it was seen. Every time Elvis performed on a show such as Milton Berle's or Steve Allen's, his record sales would shoot up. An entire television program known as American Bandstand was developed just to showcase new and up-and-coming rock and roll artists. Teens could hear their favorite rock performers on the radio and watch them on TV. They couldn't get away from rock and roll, and they didn't want to, which of course aggravated their parents. If it weren't for the disastrous years of 1957 and 58, rock might have very well conquered the nation, but in those 2 years, Chuck Berry would find himself in jail for bringing a minor across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes. Jerry Lee Lewis lost a lot of popularity for marrying his cousin, who was 14 years old at the time. Elvis Presley joined the army and got a haircut to boot. Little Richard quit music altogether and turned his life towards God, becoming a Baptist minister in the late 50s. And early Chicano rocker Ricky Valens, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper all died in a plane crash while flying to a concert venue. Indeed, by the late 1950s, rock and roll seemed to have burned too bright, too fast, and was on its way out. If not for the fact that those Memphis musicians inspired new forms of rock around the country and around the globe. Dion and the Belmonts took their Philadelphia doo-wop sound from the streets of Philadelphia to the recording studios with songs about runaways and Runaround Sue. Brian Wilson and his brothers, with friend Mike Love in Southern California, were aligning their four-part harmonies into the new rock mold. Bob Dylan found freedom in early rock and roll, freedom that would inspire him to turn the genre and the world on its head in the early 1960s. And across the ocean, young teens such as Mick Jagger, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Rod Stewart, Pete Townsend, brothers Ray and Dave Davies, and guitarists Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck were being blown away by the new sounds out of America and were considering trading away their promising college educations in exchange for the rock and roll lifestyle. So what's so revolutionary about rock? Well, two things, to be honest. First, like no other musical form before it, rock and roll panicked many parents across the country. Between the black influence of the music, the use of a backbeat, which many thought had a subliminal effect triggering more sexual behavior in teens, and the fact that rebellion itself was often a theme of the music, parents wanted their kids to turn down that noise, only permanently. Parents were afraid that the black influence in rock and roll would surely promote immorality, even promiscuous sexual behavior among their kids. Worse yet, parents feared that their white teens might begin dating black teens, or even worse. Even if a teen never met a black person, the fact that youth seemed to have no problems latching on to such a dark and ethnic form of music worried parents, especially in the South. When artists performed concerts in the South, the venues would be segregated, either with whites in the front of the venue and blacks seated in the back, or whites on one side of the venue, blacks on the other. There were many instances in the South where kids themselves were pulling down those barriers and blockades that had segregated one another and began dancing together. Some artists even refused to play to segregated audiences. Rock and roll in the early 1950s was directly challenging the notion of separating whites and blacks without making it a political issue. In other words, this form of music was challenging the very rule which defined race relations in this country from the beginning: keep everyone separate. But rock and roll was about community. It was about coming together. Kids didn't care if their favorite artists were black and white. They just wanted to hear the music. Teens also had a heck of a lot more disposable income during the 1950s, if you remember, because of their part-time jobs or the extra money that Dad was making at his white-collar job. And they used that extra money to flock to their local record store to buy race records, music that is by black musicians. And this music was often located in the very back, farthest away part of the store, kind of hidden away, almost as an attempt to discourage white kids from finding black music and buying it. But kids looked for it anyway. And as more and more of them bought more and more rock and roll, rhythm and blues, record companies that wanted to stay in business and record stores that wanted to keep their doors open had to move those products up to the front. As a result, rock music became the first, most public challenge to race relations under Jim Crow and segregation. It was a movement that wasn't political. It didn't have any singular leaders who were challenging laws or challenging the government. It wasn't a social movement in which it was directly telling the whites in the South or even the whites in the North to open up their arms to their black brethren. It was a musical movement in which it was understood that black and white was the same and black and white could work together, and the result of that collaboration was beautiful, fun, interesting music. If Martin Luther King Jr. was the force, the energy, and the spirituality behind the civil rights movement, then rock and roll was its soundtrack.